started collecting silent films in the early 50s. I'd been at a very unpleasant boarding school in England, which the only decent thing the headmaster did was to show us silent films in the winter months. And I got a taste for projection and for showing these things to people who had no idea how good they were. And I was lucky enough to find a hall in Baker Street of 9/5 Films. One of them had the front missing, so I didn't know who was in it. And my mother told me it was Douglas Fairbanks, and even I'd heard of Douglas Fairbanks. And that film proved very useful throughout my life, because the first thing was it turned me on to Douglas Fairbanks, who was one of the most creative filmmakers of the silent era. Number two, I found the cast list, and the villain turned out to be running an actors agency in London. I was able to meet him and interview him. The local library had no media studies as it would have now. It had one book on the cinema, and I expected it to fall open at a picture telling me what my film was, when it was made, and that's exactly what happened. Unbelievable. There I was looking at a still. Underneath it said American Aristocracy 1916. It had a long description of the picture. So I thought, well, if I've got a film that's in a book, I've got to find some more. And that turned me on to film collecting. The World War II generation hated silent films because, as presumably as very young people, they had been forced to look at the films that were made with the intention of putting people off. They used to take very early primitive melodramas, speed them up, put honky-tonk music on it and jokey commentaries, and people thought that's what silent films were like, which is absurd, but it did put that generation off. And to this day you'll find people in their, old people, reacting against the idea of even looking at them. This was before the National Film Theatre was created in London. One used to have to go to the French Institute, where the British Film Institute put on the classics. But they used to put them on and show them at very slow speeds, trying to be respectful and killing the picture in very bad prints. And there was no showmanship. If I had those showings only to judge that period by, I'd have given up at once. Contact with Al Parker was extremely valuable, because he took being in the business, he used to take a Roneo piece of paper which had it was called Celebrity Bulletin, and it said who was in town, where they were staying, and so he'd ring up and he'd say, Kevin, King Vidor, Hyde Park Hotel, tell him I sent you. And so I was able to make the first contacts with those people then, and already I lugged around a huge tape recorder in order to make sure I didn't forget what they said, and that gave me the ambition to go to America and meet them on their home turf. Well, you know, people in their teens, people of 18, get called up for the army. The reason is they lack all imagination. They don't know what they're in for, and so you can order them to do anything. I had no imagination. I thought if I had an idea for a film, I just went ahead and did it. I'd already made one short film, and it had only taken me 3 years to do it. So I don't know why I started this thing, but I couldn't bear the idea that I'd have to wait till I think the average age of film directors in those days was 56, and I was 18. I couldn't wait. So I started on this feature film, and the results were unspeakable. And luckily, I met an expert on that period who was 2 years younger than I was, and he became one of the top technical advisors in the business, and he worked on The Pianist for Polanski and Downfall, that German picture. And he taught me that if it isn't accurate, it isn't worth doing. and it completely changed my outlook. Well, we had a lot of luck with that picture. One of the things was Andrew Mollo, my partner in crime, went to the Tower of London for the battle scenes and got the permission to use the original armour from the Civil War. And that made all the difference. Everybody looked absolutely perfect. And then right the way through the film we had experts on what kind of pig we should have. We had to grow our own crops over a period of a year. We needed experts for that, experts on architecture. So whatever you may think of the picture, it sure is accurate. The morning that I set out to see Lillian Gish, I met Garbo on the street. Of course, I daren't say anything to her because she'd have run, but she was just coming back from the supermarket. So I thought to see Garbo and Gish in one day is quite something. And Lillian Gish was incredibly charming and welcoming and very enthusiastic. The whole idea of silent film and music was her passion. When we did Napoleon in New York, she was there, as was everybody else, and enormously enthusiastic. Nobody knew how Chaplin worked. Yes. We didn't know how Chaplin worked until we started putting the shots in numerical order, and it showed his progression, how he started on something totally different and ended up with the masterpieces that we all know. First of all, D.W. Griffith always comes across as a kind of aristocratic figure, and I was amazed to find when we went to Kentucky, he was just a farm boy. And he educated himself. He had no education to speak of. I think that is astounding. And when you think of the historical subjects that he undertook, and the people that he influenced, and the films that he influenced, if you look at the very early films, there's really nothing outstanding that jumps at you. They talk about his technical innovations, but other people were doing technical innovations too. I can't think what he came up with that was special, except that everything he did better, and he had more feeling for the characters, and so they came across as people to these vast audiences who fell in love with them and made them the most successful films of their time. And then he did, with his unfortunate film, The Birth of a Nation, it gave the industry a pride in their work. They suddenly realized that they were not just part of a vaudeville routine, which they had been up to then. They were making serious dramas. He was an extraordinary character, and it's very sad that this great man wasn't allowed to keep going in the same way as at the beginning of his career, because you can see a sound really didn't suit him, and it was like a painter being forced to take up sculpture. The Birth of a Nation caused a tremendous degree of anger among black people and their white supporters, because it twisted the history, and also it made heroes of the Ku Klux Klan, who were a pretty disgusting bunch. And unfortunately, it was also a brilliant film, probably the most brilliant film that had been produced up to that time. So you couldn't ignore it, but there were minor riots, and I interviewed a black actor, William Walker, who was desperately upset by it. And he remembered shortly afterwards the Ku Klux Klan marching through his town in Indiana. So you have to admit great work of art, which led partly to the revival of the Klan, which in the 1920s had 4 million members. And the lynchings that happened, the thousands of often innocent men were hanged. He had the chance of taking on Valentino, and he thought he was too foreign looking. But he did create a whole raft of stars like Richard Barthelmess. And don't forget Dorothy Gish is a comedienne. But people were very upset when he substituted for Lillian Gish an actress called Carol Dempster. And there was an antipathy towards her, which was probably due to the fact that everybody loved Lillian Gish so much. They felt personally slighted that he didn't continue with her. But it was her decision to go to Inspiration Pictures and become independent and so on. So he wasn't as successful in that respect. But nonetheless, what he did in the early years was, I think, makes him unique. However, there is something, can I read something to you, which I think will surprise you about his attitude, read Birth of a Nation. Gotta find this first. It's never where you'll want it. D.W. Griffith said in 1919, "There will never be a League of Nations until we cease regarding ourselves as the greatest people on earth. Until we stop speaking of foreigners, wops, chinks, etc. Then and only then will there be a true brotherhood. Until that time, the League of Nations will indeed only be a scrap of paper." Griffith surrounded himself with Germans. Wilhelm Bitzer was his cameraman. His accountant was called Epping. He had many people of German origin working for him, and they all cooperated on Hearts of the World to make the Germans more vicious, including Erich von Stroheim, of course. Actually, the Germans did create atrocities in World War I. They did behave like Nazis on many occasions, so one can't argue. But of course, it was melodramatized in that picture. However, he did go to France. He did make use of what was of history happening before his eyes, and it's an outstanding picture. It's difficult to work out what the version should be because that's been chopped up. Right. And there's an English version which is totally different to the American version. And so that does need to be restored and a proper score written. If the print is good enough, these films should be made available. And it is my belief that the film industry should make a pronouncement that all silent films are now in the public domain because it will help to save them. And it really tells you a lot about a film industry that has no interest in the silent film, and it won't let you have them. One Sunday I was dozing and I dreamt I went to Hollywood, hadn't been there yet, and I was being shown around the motion picture home by D.W. Griffith, of course, only the best, and he was showing me who was in this room, a great cameraman, that room, a great editor, and the telephone rang at the end of the corridor, and I woke up and the telephone was ringing outside my bedroom, and down the corridor I went, picked up the telephone, and it was Harold Lloyd. So that was my introduction to Harold Lloyd. I went over to the Dorchester Hotel that same Sunday morning, and that began a friendship that lasted till he died. Carl was the man who wrote the music for The World at War, so we expected a lot from him. And what was very impressive was how he tracked down the surviving musicians and found out how it was done. He himself comes from New York, so he comes from that area. And I've always felt as though he came from the silent era himself, that he was the perfect man to do every film we had, which he almost did. And I've been appalled by some of the music modern music that's been put on silence and killed them stone dead. And yet the people who do that don't seem to realize what they've done. But Carl gives them a new life, as you say, with the wind. That's wonderful. And I'm hoping that he will continue to do so. Warner Brothers have promised to bring out all the 10 Silents that they've promised for so many years. Nothing has happened. I'll believe it when I see it, but they must bring that out. It's the most popular film we've ever shown, even more so than Napoleon. People went wild about it, and quite right too. It's an astounding piece of work. I went to the Library of Congress recently. I was amazed to see how many William Desmond Taylor films there were sitting in the vaults, and they had a database of, I think it was 18,000 films that we could have chosen from. So that's just one archive.